If you're wanting to achieve a fuller range of motion overhead squat, then in this video I'm going to outline exactly how you can do that. Most people approach the situation of achieving a deeper range of motion squat by trying to put a kettlebell on their knee and trying to drive their shin forward as much as they can when they're trying to improve ankle mobility. Unfortunately, what's happening is that most people are going into plantar flexion when they're actually losing the heel when they're performing this drill. So they're actually going onto their toes and not allowing their shin to actually roll forward anymore. The best way to do this is by actually loading the foot and standing and using gravity to do this, whether it's in a plyometric or in another exercise like these low ceiling jumps. Before we get any further into drills that we can use to improve range of motion, I want to focus on the skill side of things. This is an untapped area for a lot of people, where just by understanding how we can perform an overhead squat can significantly improve how they can actually access the range of motion that they currently have. You'd be surprised how much range of motion you can unlock just by allowing yourselves to sit into your heels, flex your spine, and allow your hips to come back in space rather than continuously driving your shins forward. You can also make a ton of improvements just by making subtle changes to the actual setup of the movement. So many people have their hands far too close together. Their wrist position might need adjusting. They might need to go into more extension of the wrist, and they might also need to move their stance or just chuck in some heels to elevate their heels, whether it's using plates or actually using weightlifting shoes. To follow up with this, if you struggle with this bottom position in the snatch, just spend more time in this position. While we can use things like a jumping overhead squat or jumping in these deeper ranges, you might prefer to just sit down the bottom and just allow yourself to relax and feel what it's like to enter this deep range of motion, even if it is with a little bit of weight or just with the empty bar, before you progress and get too heavy in your main lifts. The next three things are going to be hip rotation, shoulder rotation, and allowing ourselves to move the rib cage. We'll start with hip rotation because in order to go below parallel into a squat, we're going to need good access to hip internal rotation. To improve this, we can pretty much use any loaded drill to do this, but I like to use a Jefferson or an underloaded split squat. Provided you're maintaining a neutral position and the range of motion is coming from your hip and you're not going to the outside edge of your foot or leaning forward too much, you can safe to say that you are going to be improving hip rotation long term as you progressively load this movement. Another exercise that you can use to bias more internal rotation is going to be a hinge, and I like to use a staggered stance hinge to do this, and making sure you are on that stance leg where all the weight is on that leg and you're trying to allow yourself to hinge and load and lengthen those glutes. You can use unloaded drills, but they're just not going to do anything for you long term. Now that we've sorted out the hip, now we want to try and focus on what our rib cage is doing. We want to think about how this proximal structure can actually move and side bend a little bit better so that we can increase our movement capacity here. Think about side bends. Anything where we're going into lateral flexion can be really useful for just moving and increasing the range of motion our rib cage has. A really stiff rib cage is going to cause us to compensate through our shoulder, elbow, and hands when we're going overhead. And then finally, shoulder flexion. Anything when we're biasing external rotation or shoulder rotation is going to be really useful for improving our range of motion overhead. Things like arm training where we can bias a low reach or a high reach, such as a high cable bicep curl or even a low cable bicep curl, can be really useful. Arm training in general can be underrated for this. But it's also worth noting that there can be extreme amounts of value in strength through length type movements. Kevin Foster from Javelin Anatomy spoke about this to me on the latest podcast that I did with him.
So I think people kind of get hung up on that. They say, well, I don't want to waste all this time doing flexibility, but that's kind of like a dumb starting point for the argument anyway. It's like what you need to focus on is doing what you need to do to get better at your sport. And we need to open the door to include
trying to access deeper ranges of motion, whether it's through a skin the cat or through an extreme range of motion dip, can be extremely useful for allowing yourself to unlock and access more positions overhead. Hopefully you found these things useful, and it's important to remember that just trying to add these movements into your training with a general well-rounded program is probably going to sort all of this out for you. You don't need to have a specific day where you do this. A lot of these movements can be easily integrated into a normal training program, and good general training with a good coach will probably just sort a lot of these things out for you anyway. That's all I got for today, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.